Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. Thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Bex. I'm on the events team here at Books Are Magic, and we're so excited to have you all here tonight to celebrate the paperback release of Monstrilio. We're here with Gerardo, Sámano, Córdova, and Adam Dalva, and the store is just over the moon to have them both with us here tonight to celebrate this book. Before we get going, I just have a few housekeeping notes. We'll be doing a hand-raised Q&A at the end, so think of your questions, hold on to them, they will be answered. Afterwards, Gerardo will be signing. We will, kind of towards the back of the store, we will point you in the right direction when the time comes. And if you're joining us virtually on the live stream, you can buy the book at the link in the description. So a bit about Monstrilio. It has been growing as a staff favorite all year long. There was like a fight of who gets to introduce tonight, and I won because I found the galley first, so it's mine. I read it when I first pub last March. And I've just been making everyone read it. So instead of the book description, which you all clearly read on the Eventbrite, I made a little amalgamation of the staff's collective shelf talkers, or what they would have written if I hadn't claimed the shelf talker first. A story of grief incarnate, Monstrilio reminds us of why we adore fiction. This little gremlin will horrify you and endear himself to you completely. Exploring queerness, families, and cannibalism, Monstrilio is a debut that outshines all the rest. So a bit about our wonderful writers tonight. Gerardo is a writer and artist from Mexico City living in Brooklyn. He's currently writer in residence at Fordham University and holds an MFA in fiction from the University of Michigan. His work has appeared in Ninth Letter, Passages North, Chicago Quarterly Review, and The Common. Monstrilio is his debut novel. Adam Dalva. I just wanted to finish reading the line that I wrote. Adam Dalva's writing has appeared in The New Yorker, The Paris Review, The Atlantic, and The New York Review of Books. He's senior fiction editor of Guernica magazine, serves on the board of National Book Critics Circle, and is assistant professor of creative writing at Rutgers University. Without any further delay, please join me in welcoming Gerardo and Alva. Adam.
Hi, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Because it's a paperback launch, we're going sans reading. We're going to go right into it. And we'll go for about 30, 35 minutes, so think about your questions. We are both professors, so we will be very patient with questions. We love questions, and we get really mad about dead air when no one talks in class, so we really want you to go. I have like a small confession, which is that sometimes, as an interlocutor, I am walking to a store and feeling nervous. I think, is there enough? Will I have enough? That was not the case with this book. We have so much to talk about tonight. And as I read this, I was marveling at how creative and wonderful it is. I was thinking we might give like a brief overview for those who haven't read it yet of how the book is structured, because I think it has a very fascinating structure. It has a very, very short opening, and then there are 4 first-person narrators. And we were talking beforehand about how this came to be, and I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the structuring of the book to kick us off.
Yeah, so as you said, the book is structured in 4 different parts. It starts with the mother, then it goes to the mother's best friend / maybe lover, and then the father, Joseph, and then we end with Monstrilio, or M, as he's later called. And I did not set out to write this book and like, oh, I'm going to write a 4-part book and, you know, they're all going to be these people. I'm not that big of a planner. So it just kind of like, I just started writing. And as I wrote, I found that I really loved these characters. And I did think that I wanted to write about a family. And I think a family is the parts of the family, right? And so I felt like each part of the family needed like to have their own voice. And so that's why it's structured that way, because I wanted not to be like the story of one person or being in the center. Well, I mean, Monstrilio is in the center, he's the title, but like it's really about all these people kind of like going through this experience with Monstrilio. And so I wanted like the experience of a family to come through. And what is the experience of a family? It's like the sum of its parts, right?
Not my family, but most families. I was kind of surprised when you said you weren't a planner. Most of the time when I think of writers who aren't planners, their books are mostly set over maybe compressed periods of time. This book, although not particularly long, 320 pages, the perfect length for a paperback, it has a huge number of years in it. I mean, and so how do you, as a debut novelist who's learning this form as you're writing, manage so much time in such a compressed package?
I think I had to do it because that's where like the story needed to go. I did actually start thinking like, oh, this is just gonna be like a small amount of time because that seems manageable in my brain, and like I don't want to like expand, and I don't know what's happening between all those years, and that seems like really daunting, and like writing a novel is really daunting in itself. So like I was like, I don't want to spend so many years because like that I just don't know how to do it. But as the story progressed, I saw that that's where it needed to go, and also the story. So like when it started, it was a very different novel. And it started with Magos and Lena being together when they're older and finding a boy that they don't know where he came from. And so that was like the original idea. And then it just changed into this book. But in that original idea, I was like just playing with the characters. And one iteration of the book was like these characters in 4 different universes, like living different realities. My friend Pemi here read that version.
A hero.
Yeah. And my agent too, many times. And that was like interesting, but it didn't really work as a novel. It was more like for short novellas, like pushed together, and they didn't really like come to like a summation of anything interesting. They were just kind of like interesting by themselves, and so it wasn't really like a project. But then one of those stories was like the first, like Magos's part, right? Mm-hmm. And it was like, why don't I just like continue that? Because that was like the initial idea was that like the first thing. One of the first things I wrote was that first scene that is in the book. And that is like a very powerful scene. And because I was like a debut novelist, I was like, can one get away with writing something like that? Like about a woman like taking a piece of a lung? Like, is that even like something people will buy? Or like, will they like run me out of the town? So I didn't know like you could do that. I was like scared. But then like just working through it, and encouragement of friends and agent and other people, it just kind of like became the story that it is now, and just like blindly trusting that it could be something. And that's why it does span years, because it also took years to write. But like, I think it was like an exercise in confidence as well, to just get to that point.
I mean, there's a real lesson in not seeming fearful on the page, even if you were experiencing fear in the early pages of this book. So for those who haven't read it, a child dies. This isn't a spoiler. I'm like in paragraph 1, sentence 1, and is lying in bed and is dead. And the mother opens him up and takes a piece of his lung, and it is gnarly and bloody. And pretty soon after that, this piece of lung is getting fed some chicken stock, and pretty soon after that, this piece of lung is our titular monster. I was blown away by the breakneck speed in which you went through the early pages of this book. I mean, I was 30 pages in, and there was a succubus monster thing. And so you mentioned beforehand that you went through many drafts and were thinking about that. I was impressed by how quickly you set the stakes and situation of this book, and I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that.
I think that was more because that's what I enjoy to read when like I pick up a book and like the first few pages are that intense. I'm drawn to it. So I guess that was like more like a preference, like a taste thing that I really like. I read a lot of books that take like their time to kind of like build up. And I love those books too, but but like the books that kind of like grab you and don't let you go, I was like really interested in like how can you do that, right? And also like sometimes I get bored easily, so like that was also like a way to keep me interested in my own writing, because I was like, oh, do I really care where they were before he died? And I was like, no, even though I did write some parts that were before he died, but then those weren't used for the book, but like sometimes trusting what your own intuition and your own taste is, and hopefully there will be someone out there with the same taste or the same inclination for you to read that way.
I love that. So I want to ask about, we're going to go from like grief to horror to sex in the next few minutes. So let's start with grief and we'll move towards sex. This is like a preview of coming attractions. You have some beautiful writing about grief in this book. You talk about the performance of grief at one point. At another point, you say one believes the stupidest things in grief. As I read, one thing I was really struck by was how the parents in the book seem to be at war with one another about how they are processing and feeling grief. A war that is a Cold War, but that goes on for many, many years.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could talk. I mean, we know Bluest Nights, we know Joan Didion, but this seemed to me to be a very radical approach to the writing of grief. And I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Yeah, so when I started writing about grief, I was like also very nervous because I was like, what do I know about grief? Or like really like deep grief, right? I'm not a parent and I haven't lost a child. And so like, how could I know that, right? And so like reading other stuff and like listening to podcasts about grief and stuff like that, I realized that everybody processes grief differently. And it's like a very personal process, and that's very interesting to me because I mean, there are like maybe main stages or things that we could like maybe talk about psychologically, but like everybody, it's like a very personal thing. Also, you want it to be personal. You don't want your grief to be everybody else's, because it's your loss, right? Like there's like an ownership there that I was very interested in too. And I wanted like the characters in the novel to have that, and especially Mago, she feels like she owns it, right? Like grief is mine, right? Like it should not be anybody else's, even though like obviously it's like everybody has their own. But I was very interested in how that played out and how you say like that Cold War. I love the way you put it, because it is kind of like not understanding what the other person is going through, even though they're going through similar things, but they're going through it very differently, right? And so that like lack of understanding and not being able to bridge that gap, because you're already going through that, you don't have like the energy or like the mental space or emotional space to just like bridge that gap and be like, oh, we can meet here. There's just no space for that.
And there's a second kind of grief, I think, in the book beyond the loss of a child, which is, I mean, the child reincarnates and starts eating cats and dogs and behaves poorly by the human metric. And there is like a grief, I think, you're also exploring, in the grief of being you're responsible on Earth that you love deeply, that you also know in some way is dangerous or is wrong. And I think about like films, the Kevin film about like being the parent of a potential mass shooter. The idea that the parents in this book and also the larger community around M love him and protect him, but also feel a sort of ongoing grief about the damage it might cause. That's a very interesting, almost like chemical reagent that the book possesses. And so that's another thing I was curious about.
Right. So like, what do you do when you get like something back, but it's not really what you, what you wanted? And that thing is like dangerous and not potentially, but murderous. And so
You're making excuses for it.
Yeah, exactly. And a little bit cannibalistic. And so what do you do with that? Do you stop loving them? And I think that was like my initial question when I started writing the book, even like in its initial stages, was like if your loved ones could stop loving you, like that fear that if you do something, like people will stop loving you. And I think that to me is a fear personally. And so I just wanted to explore if like that could happen. And so like, what if one is a monster with like the people around you still love you? And I think I just wanted to explore that and what that would do to people that actually do love you, right? And like that want the best for you. And then there's that like issue of like, well, I want the best for you, but the best for you is to change your basic nature, right? And it's like, well, is that really the best for you? Or how do we cope with that? How do we manage that? And I was very interested in exploring that. I don't think there's like an answer, but I was interested in what that brought out in the characters and the family, and also M, right? Because he's really trying to be that person that his family wants him to be, but he's not. And so he's like, well, what do I do, right? How do I exist, right?
And I'm interested in that, about like a question of like the positionality of a reader in relationship to M and the character. So you can tell me if I'm like reading this differently than most people are, but the final section of the book is M's perspective, and you hold that back very cannily. But even before then, even though he's like eating dogs and people and other things that, I'm not super fond of, I found myself rooting for him and caring about him, and then I felt very almost complicit as a reader. Yeah. And this to me is, there are books of horror that of course take on that positional relationship with the monster. And so even before we get to him, I think are inclined to root for him. And then of course when we get to his perspective, it complicates it even further, because in some ways I was distancing myself from him when I was in his perspective in a way I didn't beforehand.
Yeah. I think especially when he's a monster, he's like in those middle stages, he's the cutest that he'll ever be. And I think that was like a conscious choice, right? Like I wanted him to be cute because who doesn't love a cute monster? And so, yeah, I mean, I think like that's how like the book garners that like kind of like care for Monstrilio the same way his family does. And I think when he becomes like more human, there's like, or that hybrid human monster, there's a little bit more distance just because he's not like that cuddly monstery thing that you feel like you can protect. Like it's an actual full-blown human with like his own ideas and feelings and wants and desires and kinks and hunger, right? And so it's harder. Sometimes I feel like it's easier for us to care for something if we don't fully see it completely, right? But once we start seeing someone completely, it's harder because we see the flaws as well. And I think that's where that distancing, or like it becomes a little bit more like a more rugged terrain, I guess, to like traverse, to be like, oh, we love M and we might still love M, but like there are things that now we know that are more difficult perhaps to accept. And also because he's asserting his own person, right? Like, and also he's distancing himself. He's like, maybe I don't need your protection that much, right? And so there's that distancing as well.
And so there is, throughout the book, portioned out, I think, carefully, there are scenes of real horror. And the scene of dissection, of course. There's a scene not too far into the book where he breaks out of like a mesh enclosure, and there are bodies of like neighborhood animals all over. These were great and hard to read and intense. And so I'm wondering, I wouldn't describe this as a book that is gory or like a work of pure horror in this sense, because as you're hearing, there's so much psychological acuity. But I am wondering about your approach to violence.
Right. I think it would have been kind of like, doing a disservice to the character of Monstrilio if we didn't show a little bit of gore, because he is like a gory monster, right? And so like you have to see those parts. And I'm interested in horror because of that, of like the gore, like the very raw like emotionality of that. And I think horror does that beautifully. Like it traps you in like fear and like disgust and all of those emotions that may not be like the most elevated. But what if they are, right? Like why can't we like approach something through emotion, right? Like I mentioned this a lot of times, but like there's this essay, and I never remember who it's by, but next time I'll remember. But it's really talking about film, but like horror film, melodrama, and pornography. And she posits that they exist within the same realm, right? Like melodrama is kind of like the umbrella in the sense like it like it's about garnering emotions, right? So it's not an intellectual exercise, it's an emotional exercise. And it has been like relegated to like lesser forms of art just because it's quote unquote base and it's not intellectual, right? But she posits that it's also like kind of like why not? You know, like why can't we, like a melodrama because it makes you sad, a horror because it makes you afraid, and pornography because it makes you horny. So all those things, it's like just base emotions. But at the same time, she's like, why can't we use that to make something that's beautiful and that's art and that's also powerful? And I love that because it's true. We put intellect always on top and emotion always, especially in art, like in second. And I think we can do both. And sometimes like emotion can really like take us somewhere. Obviously there's questions of manipulation and things like that. But like if you're careful and if you think about those things, and if you kind of like know how to, it's craft in the end, right? And if you know how to like use those and craft those in a way that elevates your art, then why not, right? Like why not feel? Why not be scared? Why not be disgusted? Why not be horny? Why not be sad, right? And so I'm very interested in that. That's why I love horror.
So why don't there's a very natural follow-up for melodrama and kink, so why don't we do those? You're a dream. This is a moderator's dream that you just said. Let's start with melodrama. This book has a lot of melodrama in it. You wouldn't think it so far because we haven't been talking about it, but two of the characters, the two middle characters in the book, Lena and Joseph. Lena is an amazing character, and I want to really hear about her. She's in love with the mother. And also has this amazing fetish to be like bathed once a week, which I thought was fantastic. And then Joseph, all of a sudden, we're in a marriage plot where he's marrying his completely hapless fiancée, wandering around this neighborhood of Brooklyn. Just having this is the most. If you love a hapless male fiancé, Joseph's hapless male fiancé is one of. This man is in 100 scenes in this book and never knows anything. He's fantastic. But that's a lot of drama. I mean, so you have like two whole relational dramas in this book. How did you do this?
I also wanted them to have like their own life besides Monstrilio, right? So like not everything is happening because of Monstrilio, or like, so like they have more going on, right? And like for Joseph, Peter is like he's key out of this family, which doesn't work at all, but like, but that's what he's like in his mind. Is like trying to tell himself like he can rebuild something completely different. And I think that part of like melodrama or melodramatic domesticity, I think it's super fun. And I think it's also like something that can get you places that you want to be in, like at least in my book that I wanted to be, and that's how I went there. And I think like also for me, Peter is really funny, and I like really enjoyed writing him. And like the scenes he's in, for some reason they were very easy to write, because it's like it's one of those moments where it's like the family kind of like come together because he's the outsider.
He's always like in the bathroom.
Yeah, or eating by himself, or yeah, yeah.
And then what about Lena?
Well, Lena, she's I love Lena, but she was always in the book, and that's why she's in this book, which is strange because I don't know if I had planned the book from the beginning, like, oh, this is a family, blah blah blah. There would have been a Lena, but like because of how I write, and it's just like kind of like haphazard, like chaotic, and Lena is in it, and she's like very important, and she's one of my favorite characters. And I think she's part of the family, but she's also kind of like a little bit outside. And to me, she's very important because it's kind of like a way to see this situation from another perspective. And I also was very interested in how she felt like she was the monster.
Yeah. She identifies.
Yeah,
She likes Monstrilio best when he's a real monster.
Yeah, exactly. And so for her, like, she's kind of learning that a monster can be loved. So she's not learning necessarily that she's not a monster, but like how she is, that she can still be loved anyway. And that was, to me, very interesting. Also, it was interesting to me that she's like super professional at what she does. Like, she's a really excellent surgeon, but she's like a chaos and like a mess in other things. And I love that about people, that, you know, like, nobody's perfect in any way, shape, or form, but like you can be really good at something or still like really suck at the other things. And to allow that to happen, I think like she's also like, she was like really, really fun to write. And just for her, and also like, I'm always happy when like characters have like an obsession, because it's easier to write. And so she's obsessed with magos, and so it makes it easier because the goal is always so clear, right? Like, I want magos, and like I'll do anything for magos. So her decisions, even though they can be a little bit nuanced, they always point towards magos, right? Like, what does magos want, or what does magos need?
So the book, beyond her, really does explore like kink and fetish in all these very interesting ways. The last section of the book, where M is the speaker, he gets on the dating apps, and I'm sure you did research into like consensual cannibalism, because it really reminded me of the kind of famous case of consensual cannibalism about 15 years ago in the States, where he puts like, I want to bite people, and he gets a lot of responses, and he does go around this very neighborhood biting people. And so throughout, each of the chapters seemed to have a very kind of deep investment in the sexual kinks of your characters. I feel like all four of them had a very clear sexual map, actually. So I was wondering if you could talk about that, because I think often with books you have one very kinky character, and they sort of are the stand-in for everyone else, and that wasn't your approach.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I'm right, but I feel like most people have kinks.
We'll find out in the audience.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, I haven't like surveyed everybody in the world, but
if you don't ask questions, we'll do that.
Yeah, or maybe. Or also, my idea is like, maybe if we let ourselves be, we would have more kinks. Maybe. And so I'm interested in people that kind of like explore that, and I think sexuality, it's very interesting to me. It's also like a very important part of life. I think books should have more sex in general. I think not exploring that as being like, why do we need sex? Well, people have sex all the time, right? Like there are people that don't, and they have like different relationships, and that's great too, and let's explore that as well. But like, that part of yourself, of how you connect to people in like a romantic sexual level, is very important. Like, a lot of our conversations with friends, with family are about that, right? Like, how can it not be important? How can we not talk about it? Maybe we don't talk about our kinks with our parents, but like but like, we talk about like who we love and who we're like hanging out, or like if we have like romantic relationships, or things like that. And so it's so important, and it's such a crucial part of our identity and who we are and how we like navigate the world, that it made no sense for me to not kind of include a little bit of that. And I think for me, my characters are not in the norm usually, and so this is another way that they're not like in the norm, or like, yeah.
Were you I mean, in those M scenes, I mean, we know there's a chance he's going to kill and eat someone.
Yeah.
And yet they are sexy. And
Yeah.
so as a writer, you're handling like a lot of Eros and a lot of Thanatos at the same time in these moments. And so how do you handle this very close merging of horror and sex?
Right. I think I thought less about horror and sex and more about hunger.
That was my next question. Oh my God, you're a dream. It says food. Oh my God.
And so I think like those merged really like together. For hunger is like one really like super important thing, and hunger is hunger, and it's not super differentiated between sex or food. It's like an impulse for to consume something, right? And so that kind of like for him, so when I thought of that, it kind of like just like merged together, because it's like I'm kind of experience hunger right now, not specifically this type of hunger. I'm just hungry. And so it can be satisfied sexually and also eating the person. So I think that's how it came. So like if I was like in M's mindset, thinking about desire in that way, it's both like a sexual desire, but also like a desire for food.
Mm-hmm. And there's like a binge aspect, right? He finds out sometimes like after the fact. I'm thinking about a specific we don't want to spoil too much. There's like an animal that you don't want to get eaten, who you find out later got eaten twice. And the editors know what I'm talking about. I mean, I'm really interested in the way that the other three characters, with the exception of like a pretty good tuna tostada at one point, really aren't very engaged with their hunger. They're all kind of shrinking. And then this last section of the book, this is a ravenous being. And the way you write about I'm eating like half a cow, for example, with so much indulgence. I mean, it contrasts. There's a scene where they go to a fancy tasting menu restaurant in Red Hook, and you don't really do any food description. You're like, it was fine. It was good, right? And then you're eating like half a cow, and you're like, this is fucking amazing. So I was wondering if you could I mean, there's a very like guttural relationship there.
Right. And yeah, and I think like M is like super guttural, you know, like it's all about his instinct and like trying to suppress it, but at the same time it's like coming out and coming out and coming out. And so food, I mean, there's mention of food throughout the book, but it never becomes as important as it is with because food is like, he has like a very difficult relationship with food, because food to him also means eating humans, and so that is difficult to navigate. And so so that part of like eating becomes a little bit more fraught, I guess. And so, but it was really interesting exploring how that like comes about, and how, because I also thought like, so like just for like the logistics of what M wanted, because they could have been like, well, we'll just bring you steaks, you know, like every so often, and then you can be satisfied. But like his hunger had to be like it had to be dangerous. So for that to be dangerous, it couldn't just like be store-bought. And so like he develops a hunger for live things, and then because he talks about what it tastes like to kill something, right? Like to eat something that had just been alive. And so to me that was important, not only philosophically, but also like the logistically, because he needed to be dangerous. And so he needed to eat like people, and like for him, like people taste the best because they have memories and lives. And so, yeah.
One person in the audience was like, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sure you're used to that. You must have amazing Q&As. Okay, so I want to talk about art. Your bio mentions that you're involved in art. This book does something very interesting with Magos, where she, kind of like Hamlet, she kind of puts on a play that recapitulates a plot from early in the novel. It's actually exactly like Hamlet, that then like reveals sort of an internal consciousness. So the decision to make her like a burgeoning performance artist was really surprising to me, and I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Yeah, I wanted her to have a profession, but she didn't seem like she liked to do anything. But she seemed like she was an artist, right? And when I wrote that first part, she mentions that she wanted an audience when her son died. And so like going back through that, and like one of those like craft advices that we sometimes give is like go back to what you've already written and see if like you have given yourself clues as to who these people are. And this was one of those instances where like I was like, oh yeah, she loves an audience, right? And I think it just clicked that her grief, she needed to perform it, right? She needed to be seen in her grief because it's so hers that it had to be acknowledged in like a grandiose way. And so she had to like live through all of this to kind of like realize that that's how she needed to go through her grief, which is I mean it's great, but it's also selfish and it's all sorts of weird. And so, but it's also like I love that scene too, and it was so fun to write. And just kind of like imagining that, and like I thought a lot of Marina Abramovich. I didn't say that right, but
she's not here.
Yeah, maybe she'll come and haunt me. But yeah, so I thought a lot about her and kind of like those like very poised performances that she does, and like they're very existential and like just like you're there and she's there and like like all of those things. And so like I kind of wanted to recreate something like that was I also kind of wanted to recreate that idea of like other people consuming your grief in like a safer way, but it's also consuming, right? Like how you consume someone else's feelings, and that was interesting to me too.
So I'm going to do two more, and then we'll go to the audience. So start ignoring me and thinking. This book is very much, speaking of art in some ways, very conscious of its own literary status. You mentioned Julio Cortázar at one point, Shirley Jackson. Of course, I mean, Frankenstein's a clear external comp, but there are many internal comps in the book where the characters are reading books that I think offer some clues into how you'd like to be read. Yeah. So I was wondering if you could talk about the layering of other texts into your text and where you're sort of positioning this psychologically.
Yeah. Well, Shirley Jackson, I love Shirley Jackson, and I think she does horror in a way that's beautifully like internal. And her characters are weird, but their horror is like an emanation from within, right? Like it just like you're like projecting whatever's happening into this, right? The Haunting of His House is this woman's like her whole turmoil is like haunting this house. Or like We Have Always Lived in the Castle is Mary Cat. Was a wonderful character, just going. Like trying to accept that she's like that kind of person that poisons her family. Spoiler alert, sorry. I did that backwards. Yeah, go read it.
It's still good.
Yeah. Also, it was written like, what, 60 years ago?
You should have read it already.
And Julio Cortázar, just like the way he uses what you call speculative or like fantastical elements to just like enchant and also like discuss like these really like intense things that are happening so subtly and so whimsically too, that I felt like very kind of like in tune to that. So yeah.
And like his writing, this book, and there's sort of a folk tale that you kind of manufacture in the
Yeah.
book that isn't from anywhere, and
Nope.
and you've made it up, which is great. The book doesn't seem very interested in questioning like the mechanics of what has happened. There's not like this 60-page sequence you get in some books like this where everyone's like, how could this have happened? Everyone just sort of accepts it and they go X-ray them and they're like, okay, I guess this is what it's like inside. And so I was wondering if you could talk about sort of the lack of internal speculation once you've established this plot, because I thought that was great and you don't always see it.
Yeah. So speculating about like the weirdness in the book.
People seem to accept what happened
Yeah.
pretty quickly.
If they didn't, it would have become another book entirely, I think. And I wasn't interested in that book because it just becomes about like what is real and what is not real. And I wanted Monstrilio to be real. And so like that was like the goal. And so why not let it be? It's a novel. You can do anything you want in a novel. So I've learned. And so why not? You know, like you set your own rules, and the rules should serve the purpose of your story, right? And so if I had been like, oh, well, in like a real world, people would be like, oh my God, how is this possible? Like, and the tabloids would be there and like TikTok or whatever, right? Yeah. But then that becomes a whole other story, and that wasn't the story. And so you kind of like set up your own, like in any book, even like in a realist book, you set up your own world, and you live by the rules of that you've set up. And so for me, it was very important not to explain, to not take space, to not distract. And just because it's also part of like, in a more like philosophical level, just part of accepting what is.
I think that's really important. I was thinking about Jane Austen when I was reading this. It is like a big sprawling family. It's funny. It's ending with a marriage that you may or may not get to see. It really is like a realist book in a lot of ways, and there just so happens to be this thing in it.
Yeah.
So I think that's great. Okay, so when you ask questions, I have to update you all on a protocol. I have to repeat what you say for webcam. So if you do like a 2-minute question, I'm going to have to rephrase it. So just keep that in mind as you ask your questions. What have you? Yeah.
One of my favorite characters is Uncle Luke, who talks only in grunts. And I was wondering why you wanted to include a character whose communication style is different than the rest of the cast, and what role you saw him playing.
One of my favorite characters was Uncle Luke, who speaks only in grunts, and I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Yes. So I love Uncle Luke too, and I think I wanted M to have someone who he could identify with more monsterly like, I guess, or different. And I think Uncle Luke has also been affected by grief, and I was very interested in his like bodily, in his body and how it functioned. And I think his grunts are, it's a decision to speak in grunts, like it's a decision for M eventually to leave or whatever. And so I wanted to have like a different example of what could be, right? Like even like if we don't understand Uncle Luke, and Uncle Luke understand each other, and so they kind of become these pair where they kind of like don't need to say anything to kind of like bond. And so that's why Uncle Luke was important to me. And yeah, I mean, they kind of like decide to be themselves for themselves.
You can see the way in which it's kind of leading up to that, but did you ever think that there would be a totally completely different ending where he maybe didn't?
So can we spoil the book?
Yeah.
Because if I repeat it to the webcam, okay, if you mute me if you don't want the spoil, I'll wave when I'm done. So the question was, you kind of are leading M to this ending where they leave, or he leaves, and was this always the ending that you had in mind, or did you find this as you went along? Okay, you can unmute.
So going back to that time where I was writing that book, where there were 4 different universes, there were 4 different endings. And in those, there was always a character, either Santiago or like a Santiago-like character.
Santiago is the child who dies.
Yeah. So at that time, it was always kind of like Santiago or Santiago adjacent. And so he either loved or he like came to a realization or something happened. So no, it was not always that. But I also struggled. I mean, once I knew where the book was going, that seemed inevitable, and that seemed like the ending. So I didn't really struggle with that, but the only thing was like he couldn't stay and become human, and he couldn't like. There was a temptation to be like, should I be brutal and have like the family murder him or something like that, and that was just horrible.
I thought that was what might happen, though.
Yeah, it could have happened, but I think it would have also kind of like missed the love that was building, and so I don't think any of those characters could have done it, right?
It's such a treat to get to talk about an ending. This is the fun of a paperback launch, right?
Yeah.
The ending is great, and it's really surprising.
Hi, the book is amazing.
Thank you.
Can you talk about the aspect of sexuality and M's sexuality, and specifically the way his experience maybe mirrors the gay experience, and even the thoughts about the degree to which you embrace conventional society or reject it?
There's a compliment, and then it was there about M's sexuality, and how does M's sexuality sort of map onto the gay experience and kind of conforming or non-conforming in society?
Well, it definitely was on my mind as a queer person. No, but like queerness was like very, like when I started to write a book, I was like, queerness has to be in it, you know, like a big part of it, and not necessarily to be discussed as queerness, but like have it be a queer book, which is something that I tried to do. I don't know if I accomplished that, but like I wanted for it to be a queer book by itself, right? Like, and so the characters are queer, which is why not, you know, like we exist. So, and what Monstrilio goes through is obviously, it's very much like what most queer people go through, which is trying to find where you belong, right? Like when somebody tells you that your nature is wrong and you still feel like your nature is right, but you can't express it. And so that's like a thing, right? And so obviously like Monstrilio is, his expression of it is very dangerous. So that part doesn't quite check out, but but like that idea of wanting to belong does. And so that will I think just that of like wanting to belong will always be in my writing, just because it's like part of who I am. And so, yeah.
And in addition to that, I'm wondering if other readers were, I was very pleasantly surprised to find out that Joseph, who's married to a woman in the first section of the book, without you spending a lot of time on his sexuality, is engaged to a man later in the book.
Yeah.
And that was very surprising, I think. And I was realizing, I think, how heteronormative my projection onto him was as a reader. Can you talk about that too?
Yeah. Even my because when I wrote it, I was like, because going back to the 4 universes, it was easier to have his sexuality be different. But then I was like, well, sexuality is fluid. There are bisexual people in the world. He exists. So yeah. But it's also like our ingrained like heteronormativity. Even us writing it, it's like, can I get away with this? Can like a man who was married to a woman can then marry a man? Yeah. And then you like do it and you're like, yeah. So yeah, why not? You know, this is your world, you know, you're creating a world. Why not creating, like, there are parts of this world that are very like steeped into what our reality is. And then there's like other parts where it's like, this is a world that I want to be in.
We have time for 2 more. All the way in the back and then over here on the left.
You spoke earlier about how people
Yeah.
And so I wonder, like, how that affected his development and in terms, like later on, like how he grew.
You mentioned earlier that he likes the way people taste because of memory and feeling. When he was, quote, still a nugget, he attacked his grandma. And how did that developmentally impact him?
Yeah. So I think that was what. So when he's a nugget, which I love, he is still a nugget, and so he attacks the grandma, and it's the catalyst for his next transformation into like a bigger, badder Monstrilio, and that's what, like, when he's out in like the wild of Mexico City, he's attacking other things. And so I think that taste for human blood is what kind of like drives this first or second transformation. I don't know which one, but like a transformation into like a more like watermelon size Monstrilio. I like more, almost more independent, and then that's when Monstrilio also like begins to develop into talking and like things like that. And then there's like the pets, and I think that's when Monstrilio, even though he's like still a creature, starts to understand that there's like something wrong. Like he can't go to people to like eat people, that he can attack animals maybe, and he's like testing, right? And so it is only towards later in the book when he starts like going for people again, because of that memory also of like attacking Lucia, who's the grandmother.
So I'm curious because it's always difficult to write multiple point of views. So my question is, which character was the most difficult to write, and how did you work through sort of the challenges of writing multiple point of views?
It is always difficult to write multiple point of views, and I was wondering which character was the hardest to write and how you handled writing multiple points of views.
Yeah. I think one thing that helped writing multiple point of views was writing so much of the novel that didn't even make it like different novels, and just writing so much in these characters' perspectives and like many different scenarios just like made me like really an expert, like kind of like being in the world. But the character that was most difficult in the end was M. I think his voice had to be very particular, and it was like the hardest for me to kind of reach. And when I reached it, it was so easy to write, but like to get to that point was very hard, because sometimes he came out too maudlin, and I didn't want him to be too maudlin, or sometimes too like aloof. And so it had to be like the right balance of innocence and also like self-assertion and like all these things. So it was hard to get to like that sweet spot where I was comfortable like just like writing in his voice.
Thank you for this beautiful hour. It was so great being
here
with
with you.
you.
Thank you so much, Adam. Yeah. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you again all for coming tonight and celebrating this launch with us. If you are on the live stream, you can buy the book in the link description. If you're still here, we've got books. Buy them for yourself, for your friends, for all the gremlins in your life. Thank you again. Let's give another round of applause to Gerardo and Adam.
Thank you so much.
Please don't forget to grab your items. Gerardo will be signing in the back. Amali is pointing in the general direction. There's going to be a table and a desk, and we're going to get your names on Post-it notes, and it's going to be lovely. So just please grab your belongings. We're going to start packing up the chairs as soon as we can, and have a great night.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Adam. This was amazing.
What a great conversation.